Out of all the execution methods in human history, few are as horrifying or as theatrical as being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This wasn't just about killing someone. It was about making them suffer, making an example of them, and sending a crystal clear message. Don't ever betray the crown. This punishment was reserved for the crime of high treason in medieval and early modern England, and the process was as gruesome as it was symbolic. It began with the accused being dragged through the streets on a wooden hurdle, a sort of flat board, tied behind a horse. This wasn't just transportation, it was public humiliation. People spat, threw rotten food, and jeered. The journey alone could take hours. Then came the first act of violence, hanging. But not to kill. No, the rope was cut short of death. The victim dangled, gasping for air, often passing out, then being revived for what came next. Drawing was the most agonizing part. The person was disemboweled alive. Their abdomens slit open, and their intestines slowly pulled out and sometimes burned before their eyes. The executioner would also castrate the victim and remove other organs, all while they were still alive. Finally, they were beheaded, and their body was quartered, literally chopped into 4 parts. One arm, one leg, another arm, another leg. Sometimes the head and limbs were sent to different cities to be displayed on spikes, serving as a nationwide warning. One of the most famous victims of this fate was Sir William Wallace, the Scottish freedom fighter portrayed in Braveheart. In 1305, he was captured and sentenced to this horrific end in London. His head was displayed on London Bridge, while his arms and legs were scattered across Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. But Wallace wasn't the only one. This punishment continued for centuries. Even into the 1700s, men like David Tyree were executed this way, and public crowds would gather to watch. That's the wild part. These weren't secret tortures. They were events. Thousands of spectators. A festival of fear. It wasn't until 1870 that this sentence was officially abolished in the UK, nearly 500 years after it began. So next time you hear the phrase hanged, drawn, and quartered, remember, it's not just a saying. It was one of the most extreme punishments ever enforced by law. A terrifying blend of politics, power, and pain. The Brazen Bull. Imagine a solid bronze statue of a bull, gleaming in the sun, beautifully crafted, life-sized, and hollow. At first glance, it might look like art, but in ancient Greece, this was no sculpture. It was a machine built for one purpose: to kill in the most agonizing way imaginable. This was the Brazen Bull, sometimes called the Sicilian Bull. It was reportedly invented in the 6th century BCE by Perillos of Athens for the tyrant Phalaris, ruler of the city of Acragas in Sicily. The design was simple but sadistic. The condemned person would be locked inside the hollow bronze bull through a small door. Beneath it, a raging fire would be lit. Slowly, the metal would heat up, roasting the person alive. But here's the twisted part. The bull wasn't just a furnace. It was an instrument of performance. The head of the bull was fitted with a complex set of pipes and tubes, designed to turn the victim's screams into something like the sound of an enraged animal. To the crowd, it was as if the bull itself was bellowing in pain. The story gets even darker. According to legend, when Perillos proudly presented his invention to Phalaris, the tyrant wanted a demonstration. He had Perillos himself locked inside the bull to test it, though supposedly he was removed before death and then executed by other means, poetic justice, or just poetic cruelty. Historians still debate whether the Brazen Bull was a real, widely used execution device or partly exaggerated as propaganda against tyrants like Phalaris. But the accounts are chilling enough that the legend has endured for over 2,000 years. If it did exist, the victims weren't just executed. They were spectacle. The crowd would watch the bronze surface turn red hot, smell the burning flesh, and hear the distorted wails echo through the metal. The Brazen Bull became a symbol of tyranny and excess. And according to some versions of the story, Phalaris himself eventually met his end in the very same device he once used on others. True or not, the tale of the Brazen Bull is a reminder of how far human imagination can go. Not just to create beauty and art, but to engineer some of the most terrifying punishments in history. Of all the execution methods in history, impalement might be the one that haunts people the most, because it was slow, public, and unimaginably painful. The process was horrifyingly simple. A long wooden or metal pole, sharpened at one end, would be forced through the victim's body. The point of entry varied, sometimes through the abdomen or chest, but most notoriously, through the rectum or vagina. The pole would then be angled carefully upward, often emerging from the shoulder, mouth, or neck. And here's the truly chilling part. Skilled executioners knew how to avoid major organs, so the victim wouldn't die quickly. They could be kept alive for hours, even days, slowly sliding down the pole under their own weight. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about sending a message. Impalement was almost always done in public, with crowds watching. The pole would be planted upright in the ground, and the victim would be left on display for all to see. A grim warning to anyone thinking of disobeying the ruler's laws. The most infamous figure associated with impalement was Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler, the man who inspired the Dracula legend. In the 15th century, during his battles against the Ottoman Empire, Vlad reportedly had thousands of prisoners impaled outside the city of Târgoviște. One story claims that in 1462, Sultan Mehmed II marched into Wallachia only to find a forest of the impaled, a field filled with over 20,000 Ottoman soldiers, their bodies rotting on spikes. The sheer horror of the sight was enough to make the Sultan retreat. For rulers like Vlad, Impalement wasn't just execution, it was psychological warfare. It broke the enemy's spirit without firing another arrow. Thankfully, impalement as a legal punishment has long disappeared, but its legacy remains as one of history's most gruesome symbols of cruelty and power. Even today, the name Vlad the Impaler instantly conjures images of a ruler who quite literally ruled by the spike, burning at the stake. It's one of the most infamous punishments in history, and for centuries, it was the ultimate symbol of public shame, religious authority, and raw fear. The method was simple in design, but brutal in reality. The condemned would be tied to a wooden post, surrounded by a pile of kindling, branches, and fuel. Sometimes the fire was lit high and hot for a quick death, but other times, deliberately, the flames started low, slowly creeping upward, prolonging agony. In medieval Europe, this was often a punishment for heresy, witchcraft, and treason. It wasn't just execution, it was a moral performance. The burning would be done in the town square, with priests or officials reading out the crimes, while crowds gathered to watch. One of the most famous victims was Joan of Arc. In 1431, at just 19 years old, she was convicted of heresy and burned alive in Rouen, France. Witnesses said she asked for a cross to be held in front of her as the flames rose, and her courage under torture turned her into a martyr, eventually canonized as a saint. But Joan was far from alone. During the European witch hunts between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands of women, and some men, were executed by fire. Many were victims of hysteria, superstition, and political or personal grudges disguised as justice. The cruelty could be calculated. In some cases, executioners used damp wood to produce more smoke and less flame, causing death by suffocation before the burning consumed the body. In others, they made the fire small so the condemned would roast slowly, prolonging the suffering for the crowd's grim entertainment. Burning at the stake gradually faded as laws changed and more humane execution methods emerged, but its legacy remains burned, quite literally, into history. It stands as one of the most notorious examples of how fear and power can turn public spaces into theaters of death. Crucifixion. The very word sends a chill down the spine. It was one of the ancient world's most agonizing and humiliating execution methods, designed not just to kill, but to send a lasting public warning. Most famously used by the Romans, crucifixion was reserved for the worst criminals, slaves, and enemies of the state. The process began with a brutal flogging, leaving the victim's back shredded and bleeding. Then came the cross, often a heavy wooden beam, which the condemned was forced to carry through the streets to the execution site. Once there, the victim was either tied or nailed to the crossbeam, through the wrists and sometimes the feet. Contrary to popular belief, nails through the hands alone wouldn't support the body weight. The wrists were the stronger point. The cross was then hoisted upright, leaving the victim hanging in a slow, torturous position. Death didn't come quickly. It wasn't blood loss that killed most victims. It was asphyxiation. Hanging by the arms made it nearly impossible to breathe, forcing the victim to push up on their nailed feet just to draw a breath, each movement sending waves of pain through their body. Some lingered for hours, others for days, exposed to the scorching sun, cold nights, thirst, and jeering crowds. To hasten death, executioners might break the victim's legs, a method known as cruelest, removing their ability to push up and breathe. One of the most famous crucifixions in history is that of Jesus of Nazareth, around 30 to 33 CE, under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. But Jesus was far from the only one. In 71 BCE, after the Spartacus slave revolt, the Romans crucified over 6,000 prisoners along the Appian Way, turning the road into a grim corridor of death. Crucifixion was eventually banned in the 4th century CE by Emperor Constantine, who considered it too cruel even for Rome. Yet its image, a cross silhouetted against the sky, remains one of the most enduring and symbolic in human history. It was the perfect Roman punishment, long, public, and unforgettable. Stoning, also known as lapidation, is one of the oldest execution methods in recorded history, and one of the most brutal in its simplicity. No elaborate machinery, no complex setup, just a crowd, a victim, and stones. Historically, stoning was used in many parts of the world, from the ancient Middle East to parts of Africa and Asia. It appears in religious texts, including the Bible and the Quran, often as punishment for crimes like adultery, blasphemy, or violating community laws. The process was designed to be a communal act. The condemned would often be placed in the center of a circle, or buried up to their chest or waist in the ground, making escape impossible. Then the crowd, sometimes made up of neighbors, community members, even family, would throw stones until the person died. It wasn't meant to be quick. In fact, the stones were often chosen to be large enough to cause pain and injury, but not so large that they would kill instantly. The result was a slow, agonizing death from repeated blows, internal injuries, and head trauma. One of the most famous stoning stories comes from the biblical account of Stephen, considered the first Christian martyr. In the book of Acts, Stephen is stoned to death after being accused of blasphemy, while a young man named Saul, later known as the Apostle Paul, watches. But stoning wasn't just ancient history. It's still recorded in modern times in certain regions under strict interpretations of religious law. The most notorious recent cases have often sparked global outrage, with human rights groups calling it a violation of basic dignity in life. The power of stoning as a method of execution lay in its symbolism. It wasn't just the state or the ruler carrying out justice. It was the community itself. The victim didn't just face death. They faced rejection by every hand that cast a stone. It's a punishment that has lasted thousands of years, not because of technology or efficiency, but because of its raw, primitive ability to turn the act of killing into a collective ritual. And that's why even today the word stoning carries a chilling weight. Now, of all the punishments in history, few are as viscerally horrifying as boiling to death. It sounds like something from a horror film, but for centuries, it was very real. The method was exactly what it sounds like. The condemned person would be placed into a large cauldron, vat, or pot filled with liquid, sometimes water, sometimes oil, tar, wine, even molten metal, and then heated until it boiled. The process could be done slowly, placing the victim in cool liquid before lighting the fire, forcing them to feel every gradual degree of heat, or they could be dropped into already boiling liquid for a quicker, but still excruciating end. Boiling wasn't just about punishment. It was a public spectacle. In medieval Europe, large cauldrons were set up in marketplaces, and crowds would gather to watch. It was considered a way to send a terrifying message. Commit the same crime, and this will be you. One of the most infamous uses of boiling happened in England in the 1530s under King Henry VIII. Parliament passed a special law making boiling the punishment for certain kinds of murder, particularly poisoning. In 1531, a man named Richard Roos was accused of poisoning porridge, served to the Bishop of Rochester's household. He was boiled alive at Smithfield, London, in front of a massive crowd. But Europe wasn't the only place this was done. Historical records show boiling being used in parts of Asia and the Middle East, sometimes as punishment for treason, rebellion, or assassination attempts. In some Mongol and Persian accounts, enemies were executed by being submerged in molten metal, turning the act into both torture and a grotesque display of power. The horror of boiling lies and its slow inevitability. Unlike beheading or hanging, there's no instant end. The victim suffers until the heat overwhelms the body. It's a form of execution designed not just to kill, but to burn itself into the memory of everyone watching. Thankfully, boiling as an official punishment disappeared from most legal systems centuries ago. But as a piece of history, it remains one of the clearest reminders of how creative and cruel humans have been when it comes to inflicting pain. Some execution methods kill quickly. Flaying was never one of them. To be flayed meant to be skinned alive. The outer layer of your body slowly peeled away, often in front of a crowd. It wasn't just about ending a life. It was about unimaginable pain and leaving a mark, literally, on history. Flaying has been recorded in multiple cultures for thousands of years. The ancient Assyrians were infamous for it, using sharpened blades to strip the skin from prisoners of war, rebels, and criminals. They didn't just kill their enemies. They displayed the skins on city walls as a warning. One of the most infamous stories comes from Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian. He describes how a Persian judge named Sisamnes was caught accepting a bribe. As punishment, King Cambyses II had him flayed alive, and then ordered his skin to be used as the covering for the judge's chair. Sisamnes' own son was forced to sit on it as the new judge, a constant reminder of what corruption could cost. The Aztecs also practiced ritual flaying. Victims would be sacrificed, skinned, and their hides worn by priests during religious ceremonies honoring Xipe-Totec, the god of fertility and renewal, a gruesome belief in death-feeding life. The horror of flaying wasn't just in the pain, but in its slow inevitability. Human skin is our largest organ, loaded with nerve endings. Removing it meant triggering every pain receptor at once. Even small sections could cause shock. Stripping large areas almost always led to infection, blood loss, and a prolonged, agonizing death. Today, flaying is banned worldwide, but its legacy is carved into history as one of the most terrifying punishments ever devised, a mix of cruelty, political theater, and psychological warfare. It's a reminder of just how far humans have gone, not only to kill, but to make sure their enemies were remembered, in pieces. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and informative. If you did, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos covering more health topics and science content. Feel free to drop any questions or suggestions in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for your support, and I'll see you in the next one.